what ways has the Chinese Communist regime managed to deceive America and control how people talk about it? Why did it take so long for the threat of Communist China to become more widely recognized? And what are the key elements of the Chinese regime's strategy to achieve global dominance? We discuss Communist China's strategy of unrestricted warfare and how Western technology has been used by the Chinese regime to create its system of high-tech totalitarianism, which it tries to export globally. We also look at some of Geertz's recommendations for dealing with the Chinese communist threat.
That I really got launched into this field after going to the Pentagon for a background briefing on the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. Back then, the Pentagon was much more press-friendly, and the Defense Intelligence Agency actually provided me with a backgrounder, and it was fairly vanilla and not real specific, but at the end of the briefing, a colonel came in and said, "The general would like to see you." And so the general turned out to be the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Okay.
And he sat at the end of a conference table, and we're in this windowless room in the Pentagon, and he said to me, he said, "Bill, you know, China's not a threat." And my journalistic instincts were immediately to ask him, "Well, why do you think that?" And his reply was, and I'm paraphrasing, was basically because the Chinese say they're not a threat. And this was, to me, really astounding to the extent to which I feel that China has been able to influence perceptions in the United States. And it's also part of a deception effort on the part of the communist regime in China. Fast forward a couple of years after that, and a couple of books, and including The China Threat, which you mentioned, I found out why the general had this incorrect view of China. And it turns out that there was a Chinese spy inside the DIA. His name was Ron Monteperto. He was convicted of passing classified information to two Chinese military attaches at the Chinese embassy. And so I realized it was bad influence, that this spy was a very influential analyst, and he had influenced a number of other analysts throughout the US intelligence community. This idea that if we engage in China, and by engagement I mean if we do business with them, and if we moderate our policies and we don't criticize China, and if we're nice to the communist regime in Beijing, that this would create a benign non-communist power. And this gamble has been an utter disaster, stretching back more than 30 years. I trace the origins of it to Henry Kissinger's Cold War era idea of playing the China card, which was a strategic gambit. The US aligned with China, again, bailing out the Communist Party once again, that it has done several times. But one of the real disasters of the engagement policy has to do with the spread of nuclear weapons. One of the Clinton administration's initiatives was to do nuclear cooperation with nuclear laboratories. The US would send nuclear scientists to China, China would send nuclear scientists here. Within a very few short years of that program, the CIA concluded in a public assessment that secrets related to every deployed nuclear warhead in the US arsenal was stolen by China through espionage. And so we lost this valuable nuclear technology. Not only that, China shared this technology with Pakistan. And then Pakistan, through the AQ-Khan nuclear supplier network, spread this technology to North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Libya. And their deception was, we're not a communist power, we're a friendly power, we want to be friends with the United States. And that began this 30-year integration. So they presented a friendly face, but behind the scenes, they were engaged in massive theft of American technology and know-how. Again, this has gone on with literally no pushback from successive administrations throughout the 2000s, leading up until the Trump administration, where finally the president, Trump, was the first one to say, no nation can survive when upwards of $600 billion a year in technology is being stolen by a foreign power and being used by that power to modernize its economic system and to use it against the United States. that there were clear directives from within the highest levels of the US government that said, we will not publicly state that China is stealing our technology. We will not do this. Law enforcement was discouraged from going after Chinese technology spies. That's all changed. We're right now in the midst of a major crackdown on Chinese, both traditional espionage as well as economic espionage. Chinese ideology today is a mixture of Soviet origin, Marxism, Leninism, and traditional Chinese ideas and concepts. And one of those is the idea of military strategy based on a period from the Warring States era. This was the period roughly 400 BC to 200 BC. And many people are very familiar with Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategist. He was from around that period. His focus was mainly on intelligence, how to defeat your enemy without firing a shot. Deceiving the Sky comes from a book called The 36 Strategies, which is dated from around 200 BC. And the number one of the 36 strategies is deceive the sky to cross the ocean. And it's basically a story about how a military commander was able to deceive the emperor himself in order to achieve a military objective. And the story is that this military commander wanted the emperor to go to war with a neighboring kingdom. And the emperor was reluctant to do that. So the military leader arranged for a dinner at a wealthy peasant's home. And when the emperor came to the wealthy peasant's home, he stepped into the house and felt the house move. And what in reality was that this was a boat, and the emperor and the general sailed away off. So the emperor had to decide, should he go to war or return back? And he decided to go to war. And so the meaning here is that in order to achieve your victory, you must be willing to deceive the emperor, who in Chinese culture is considered heaven or even God. So you must be willing to deceive God himself in order to achieve your military objectives. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Communist China is doing today in its dealings with the United States.
So, one of your first chapters, I found this very interesting, was, I think it's titled Communists Lie, or something very, very close to that, or the Communist Lie. Explain to me why you have a whole chapter dedicated to this idea.
I have been writing about these issues extensively. I went through the body of my material on China and national security affairs over the past 20 years, and it was truly an incredible amount of really eye-opening stories that were groundbreaking and totally eye-opening in terms of highlighting the China threat. So I had so much material. What I decided to do was to focus on case studies. And I took a number of case studies, and one of the case studies, again, it was on how communists lie, was to identify China's reaction to a seminal event in the history of national security affairs, and that was the 2007 anti-satellite missile test.
Right.
And I went throughout, and I had a lot of material on this, so I highlighted how China had deceived the world, mainly the United States, about this test. And what happened was, in this test, they fired a missile at an aging weather satellite, and it created a massive debris field, which right now threatens both spacecraft and orbiting space stations, and will for over 100 years. And so this, how China reacted to that, first was they lied about it. And I point out that this is the key reaction of communist regimes, is they lie, then they deceive, then they mislead. I've been urging the Trump administration, the most important thing they could do right now would be to publish a book-length white paper on the nature of the Communist Party of China. I often tell people when I talk about China, the China threat is not the Chinese people, it's the Chinese Communist Party. And a Chinese general, a colonel, one time visited me at the Washington Times, and I made that point to him, and he was totally adamant that there is no difference between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. And this is, again, another major deception. So it's important, I feel, to really highlight this issue of Chinese communist ideology. They have been very aggressive in literally buying up former officials. They can buy politicians. They can covertly contribute to members of Congress political campaigns. But I think it's through former officials and businesses that they've had the most influence. I know that China has used its American companies doing business in China. They will go to those companies and they'll say, we don't like this legislation that's being drafted on Hong Kong, and we expect you as a friend of China and someone who's doing business in China, and if you want to continue doing business in China, you have to go to the Congress and lobby against this legislation. This is a common tactic. It needs to be exposed. I hope to be doing some of that kind of reporting in the future to look at some of this in-depth influence operations of the Chinese Communist government. How China is working against Trump's re-election. He said that basically the Chinese have decided they want a different president. And this is the work of the United Front Work Department, which again, its activities have been expanded under Xi Jinping. It's essentially political warfare / intelligence operations designed to promote the Communist Party of China's strategic objectives. I presented how China would conduct a surprise attack on the United States, and that one of the first things they would do would be to disable the missile warning satellites that we have. That is one of our assassin's mace weapons, the ability to detect a missile launch any place on the planet. And by using a combination of deception and laser attacks, they could take out the satellite and then successfully conduct a surprise strategic missile strike, kind of what I describe as a global Pearl Harbor. As part of China's drive for global supremacy is that they want to export this high-tech totalitarian system to the entire world. And so it was important, I felt, to at least begin to let people know the kinds of things that they're doing. First, they have a social credit system, which is, I think, in kind of the early stages of its repressive features. And this is a system whereby anyone perceived by the party regime in China to be in any way nonconformist, politically unreliable, they don't get to travel. So if you want to travel by train or by air, you can't travel. I think they're going to expand it in many other ways, such as not being able to get housing or not being able to buy food. So it's certainly troubling. I think we're seeing, I think, the greatest mass repression right now in Western China, where in the area known as East Turkestan, or what China refers to as Xinjiang, where we see between 1 and 2 million people are being placed in concentration camps. Recent photos have showed some of these operations. China is using technology, a lot of it stolen from the United States, for facial recognition to identify people that they want to do surveillance and use it as a control mechanism. The ultimate objective of all this high-tech totalitarianism is ultimately control. The real existential threat, in my view, is communist China, and I'm doing everything I can to alert people to that. It's a major deception. Yeah, the Chinese have plans to expand their system, even economically. They would like to replace the dollar-based global economic system with a yuan-based system. They want their currency to do that. We see them expanding through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a multi-trillion-dollar investment program, which I regard as really a Trojan horse of Chinese expansionism and drive for global dominance. For example, they're going into developing countries, and they will tell these poor developing countries, we'd like to build a railroad for you as part of infrastructure development. And so they said, we'll even lend you the money. And then they lend the money at an exorbitant interest rate. And when the country can't pay the debt, the Chinese will then come in and say, well, that railroad is now ours. And in this way, they're literally buying up and taking over countries. And I think they have a strategy to try to encircle the United States and perhaps Europe with their system. And again, this brings in the whole idea of cornering the market on 5G, advanced telecommunications technology. I mean, aside from their official lobbying, they have unofficial lobbyists. They have interest groups. They have committees of people who are considered, quote, friends of China. And China has been able to manipulate these groups, often by access to China. For example, if you're an expert on China at one of the think tanks, your job would be to travel to China. But China tightly controls its access to the country. No one can travel to China if they're regarded as not a friend of China. For example, myself, I've been able to travel to China on a number of occasions, most recently in June of 2018, where I traveled with the Secretary of Defense to Beijing. But for others, you can't get into the country if you don't toe the Friend of China line. And again, they've done this through buying up officials, through United Front work, department work. It's an extensive effort. I think the first thing is we need to be able to tell the truth about Communist China, which is something we have not been able to do for many years. I think we need to liberate the Chinese people. I dedicated the book to the Chinese people because they do not want to live under that system. They have had a taste of what it's like to live in a free society like the United States, and they go back to their home country, and it's not free. And when I was in Beijing, I felt like it was an information desert. You could not access the common things that we do, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or those kinds of things. And the Chinese Communist Party tries to control all of the information. So my thing is we've gone part of the way in identifying China as a strategic competitor or adversary, but not as a real enemy. And I think that we need to do that first. We need to be clear on the nature of the threat. And then we can begin taking the kind of steps that can mitigate this threat and what we can do. What China needs is a democratic political reform. And that will never happen as long as the Communist Party of China is in power. Ultimately, I think we need to change the Communist Party of China.